Morning and welcome again to our online Bible study. Our theme is Your Kingdom Come, taken from the Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We're going to be looking at our subtitle today, Created in His Own Image. And we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. And you're saying, this is a genealogical record of Jesus Christ. And what does that have to do with anything? Well, we're going to dive into it. We're going to be looking at the first 6 verses of the book of Matthew in the first chapter. This is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So this is Jesus' lineage as far as his humanity is concerned, that it traces all the way back to King David and to the founder of our faith, Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. So these are the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Jacob's son, Judah. And of course, Jacob had 12 sons. So when it says Judah and his brothers, but Jesus comes from the son of Jacob, Judah. And Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Perez, the father of Hezron. And Hezron, the father of Ram. And Ram, the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab, the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon, the father of Salmon, and Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David, the king, and David was the father of Solomon, by the wife of Uriah. Now, in both the pagan and the Jewish culture of that day, men had little regard for women. In that era, Jewish men would pray every morning, thanking God that they were not Gentiles, slaves, or women. And to think that women were regarded more highly among the Jews than among the pagans. So you can just imagine how other cultures esteemed women or disesteemed women. And the fact is that women were rarely mentioned in genealogies. So being in a man's world, this genealogy has the unusual mention of 4 women in these 6 verses. There's another woman that is listed, but that's later on, and that's talking about Mary, so that gets all the way down to his birth. But in just the first 6 verses, there's 4 women that are listed, and that's totally unusual to mention women in a genealogical record. So you have to ask yourself, who were these women? And why did Matthew deem it necessary to highlight them in the beginning of his gospel account? Because he did. I mean, he highlighted 4 women in these 6 verses. After all, he could have left these women out altogether, and no one would have cared or even known the difference. In our biblically illiterate world in which we live, most people wouldn't even, they probably just glance right over it and don't think a thing about it. But this was a big deal. This is really a big deal that he would point out these 4 women in this genealogical record in these first 6 verses. Now, you think, well, what was so special about these women? What was so great about them? Well, let's dive into this. The 4 mentioned here are of special note because they're examples of God's grace God's grace that was demonstrated in the lives of these women. They show how God uses people that we wouldn't even take a second glance at probably. So let's look at these honored women. And the first one that is mentioned is Tamar. We have to say, well, who was Tamar? Well, Tamar was the daughter-in-law of Judah. And we said that Judah was the son of Jacob, who was one of the patriarchs of the nation of Israel. If it wasn't for Jacob, there wouldn't be 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob had 12 sons. Judah was one of those. He was his fourth son. He wasn't at the top of the totem pole, but he was number 4. And these were the patriarchs of the nation. And in fact, it was Judah that picked out Tamar to be his son's wife. Let's read about that in Genesis chapter 38, verse 6. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So in those days, the father would pick out the son's wife. He would negotiate with the woman's family, and they would make an agreement with each other. So it was Judah who selected Tamar to marry his son So Tamar was the daughter, well, wait a minute, I went backwards, sorry. Unfortunately, Tamar's husband, Judah's son, died. And more to the point, the scripture says that the Lord put to death. In Genesis 38, verse 7, but Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Now think about that. The son of Judah, the son of Jacob, he was wicked, and God put him to death. Now, it was customary in those days that if a man died without any children, the next of kin was to marry his widow in order to raise up offspring for the deceased. But Onan, Er's brother, did not like that idea at all. He didn't want to do that. He didn't want to marry Tamar for whatever reason. I don't know about Tamar. I don't know what the problem was. But in Genesis 38, verses 8 through 11, this is where we get the information. It said, then Judah said to Onan, go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. Well, maybe he just didn't like his brother. We don't know really what his motivation was, but he just didn't like this idea at all. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So, whenever he went in to his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. So he wasn't going to perform his duty as the next of kin. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord. And he put him to death also, because Onan would not fulfill his role of what they called the kinsman redeemer, the one who would perpetuate the name of his family member, his close family member, in this case his brother. He didn't want to do it, and he wasn't going to perpetuate it. That just showed you how God, how much family meant to God, and how much the perpetuation of a person, to have an heir, someone to carry on their family name, was important. In verse 11, then Judah said to Tamar, this is after Onan was dead, because God put them to death. Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up." So Shelah wasn't old enough to get married yet. So he's telling Tamar, go back home to your dad, your father's house, and stay there. But Judah feared that Shelah would die like his brothers. So he didn't want to see another son die. So here Tamar, she went and she remained in her father's house. So here was Tamar, twice a widow. She had no choice. I mean, there was no choice. She didn't have any say in this matter. She's left to wait at her father's house for Judah's youngest son to grow up. Now, here is Tamar, and what about her hopes and dreams of having a family, of having children, of, being like everybody else? But no, I don't know how old she is at this time, but she's had to go back to her father's house. And it's been a long time. And we know that as the story progressed, Judah double crosses her. For even after Shelah was grown, Judah didn't keep his promise. He didn't want to lose another son. He had already lost 2 sons in this whole deal, and he didn't want to lose Shelah as well. So Judah kept putting Tamar off. Now, in the meantime, Judah's wife, his own wife, dies. And when that happens, Genesis 38 again, verses 12 through 15. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she comes up with a plan. She took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. So here, Judah hadn't kept his word. And here she was stuck at her father's house. And of course, she had no choice. She couldn't marry anybody else. She was committed to wait and let Judah provide for her. But when Judah saw her, she's all wrapped up, and even her face is veiled. Well, he thought she was a prostitute, the way that she was dressed. For she had covered her face, so he couldn't see who it really was. So he thought she was a prostitute, one of those quote-unquote temple prostitutes, if you will. Thus Judah, and you'll have to read the whole story, but anyway, Judah has sex with Tamar, thinking she was a prostitute, and she became pregnant, and she conceived twins, one of which was Perez, who, by the way, is listed in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. What a story, right? To be part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Here was a woman who was used and abused by 3 men. By her 2 husbands, and Onan and Judah. But she ends up making a name for herself in the history of their nation by bearing an offspring in the lineage of King David and King Jesus. She does this through her father-in-law. Of course, his wife was dead, so it wasn't adultery or anything like that. But here she has a child by her father-in-law. How strange a story is that? The next one on the list is Rahab, the prostitute. That's how she's identified in the scriptures. According to Easton's Bible Dictionary, when the Hebrew people were encamped at Shittim in the Arabah or Jordan Valley opposite Jericho, this was with Joshua and the children of Israel when they were ready to cross over the river. And Joshua, as a final preparation before they went to Jericho, he sent out 2 spies to spy the land. He wanted to get a feel for what they were going to face once they went to Jericho. That was the first place that Joshua and the people of Israel faced when they went into the promised land. And after 5 days, these spies returned, having swum across the river, which was at that season the month of Abib. It overflowed its banks from the melting of the snow on Lebanon. So the spies reported what had happened to them, and you can find that story in the 2nd chapter of Joshua. And of course, being a spy, that's risky business. So they had been exposed to danger in Jericho. And they had been saved by Rahab the harlot, to whose house they had gone for protection. Now, I had heard this, that the kings in those days, they would use prostitutes in the city to be like their spies, like their CIA or FBI, their intelligence agency, because usually men would, when they'd go into the city, they would find these places of ill repute, and then they would spill whatever, their mission was to the prostitute, and then the prostitute would tell it to the king. So here was the prostitute who had a house right inside the city walls itself. And she's the one that provided protection for the spies of Israel. Because she knew, she even said it, she knew that God was with them. So she provided protection. She kept them safe while they were there. She told them what was going on inside of the city. And so when the city of Jericho fell, when Joshua and his men marched around the city 7 days, well, Rahab, God, the spies had made a promise to her. And so Rahab and her whole family were saved according to the promise of the spies, that they said, if you will not turn us in, if you'll keep us safe, then we'll save you when we come in. And so Rahab and her whole family were assimilated among the Jewish people. She was a Canaanite, right? And yet because she provided safety for the spies of Israel, she was assimilated into the Jewish people. And afterwards, she became the wife of Salmon, a prince of the tribe of Judah, who was one of the 2 spies that had gone into the city. So Rahab she was a Canaanite, she was a prostitute, but she married into the family of Salmon. So Rahab is therefore listed in the Hall of Faith in the book of Hebrews, and she's honored by James, the half-brother of Jesus. So if we look at the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31, it said, by faith, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. And then in James chapter 2, verse 25, and in the same way was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers or the spies of Israel and sent them out by another way? She helped them to get back to Joshua safely. She told them what to do. So here, an unlikely candidate to be one of the ancestors of Jesus Christ, a prostitute. You know, Jesus was accused of associating with tax collectors and prostitutes. And in his family lineage, there was a prostitute. The next one that is mentioned, the next woman that's mentioned in the genealogical record that Matthew gives us, was Ruth. Now, Ruth was not Jewish. She was a Moabite. She was a descendant of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew. And the Moabites, their land was southeast of the Dead Sea. So they were neighbors of the nation of Israel. But she married Mahlon, a Jewish man from Bethlehem in Israel, who had migrated to Moab due to a famine in Bethlehem. So Mahlon and his family had decided that because of the famine in Bethlehem, and by the way, Bethlehem means house of bread, but the house of bread was having a famine, and they decided to go to Moab because they heard that there was food there. But as the story unfolds, her husband Mahlon, as well as her father-in-law and brother-in-law, they become sick and they died. And so Ruth, at that point, Naomi decides that she's going back to Bethlehem because she doesn't have her husband or sons. She has no one in Moab except her daughters-in-law. But Ruth decides to go with her mother-in-law. And you know, it's a famous story. I'll go where you go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. You know, she had a devotion to Naomi, her mother-in-law. And they went back to Bethlehem because they had received word that the famine was now over. And so maybe they could, you know, make a living for themselves. Now, Ruth is famous for her faithful devotion to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and for her hard work of gleaning in the fields of her wealthy neighbors in order to make a living and put food on the table for the two of them. They didn't have husbands to take care of them, to make a living for them. So Ruth was out there working hard all day long, gleaning in the fields, the leftovers from the harvest. In the process, we know that she catches the eye and the attention and the favor of the landowner of the field in which she was gleaning. And as it turns out, the landowner Boaz is a relative of her father-in-law Elimelech. So since Mahlon, Ruth's husband, didn't have an heir, for they didn't have any children, Boaz ended up becoming the kinsman redeemer by remarrying Ruth and having a child by her named Obed. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David the king. And you can read the whole story in the book of Ruth. There's only 4 chapters, but it's a beautiful story there. So Ruth's son, who was a Moabite, she was a Moabite who married a Jewish man. Well, her son, by Boaz, became the grandfather of King David. Think about that. If it had not been for Ruth, would David have been born? Would David be the man that he became? In Ruth chapter 4, verse 10, it said, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I, Boaz, have bought to be my wife. Notice what it says there. It's like she's a slave. I bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, to perpetuate the name of Mahlon, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. So that's what Boaz said to those that were there at the city gate At the city gate is where they did their courts, where they held their courts at the city gate. And so here is Boaz presenting his case and saying, I am purchasing Ruth the Moabite. I am going to be the kinsman redeemer. I'm going to do my responsibility. And so she was, as he termed it, that she was bought to be my wife. So she was more or less a slave. But anyway, when we see the love story there, I mean, there's more to it than just being a slave in that story. And then the last of the 4 women that are mentioned in those 6 verses in Matthew chapter 1 is Bathsheba. And he doesn't even mention her name. He just says the wife of Uriah. So Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So he wasn't Jewish. Uriah wasn't Jewish. But he was one of the most faithful and loyal soldiers that David had on the battlefield. Uriah would have done anything for David. He was a loyal, trusted soldier, even though he was not Jewish. But we know the story that as David grew older, he'd been fighting so many battles. He had been running for his life from King Saul for years, out in the desert and the caves, and even going into Philistine territory and then fighting the Philistines. And as you get older, you get tired. Your body, you don't have the energy and you don't have the stamina that you once did. So he got tired of fighting all these battles. And so he said, I'm going to let the younger boys do this. So he decided to stay at home. But the problem was, here his soldiers were out on the battlefield fighting their enemies. But David, what was he supposed to do? I mean, he's bored. All he knows is running for his life or fighting the enemies on the battlefield. So he gets bored. There's no TV. There's no other so-called distractions. So he's walking around on his balcony one night, and he looks across the way and he sees a beautiful woman taking a bath. And even though David had multiple wives at that time, the lust and the temptation became too great for David. The enemy was at work to try to destroy David. So unfortunately, he gives in to the temptation. He sends his servant to fetch her, and then he committed adultery with her because she was still married to Uriah the Hittite. And she conceived. She became pregnant as a result of that. And to cover up what David had done, he tried to get Uriah off the battlefield and go home to his wife so they could say, well, it wasn't David's baby, it would be Uriah's, but Uriah wouldn't cooperate, and so David has her husband killed on the battlefield. And after her husband was slain, and you can read about this in 2 Samuel chapter 11, well, David marries her. But he had already committed adultery with her. So the child that was born in adultery died. And you can see that story. You can see that story in 2 Samuel chapter 12. But David repented of his sins, and he went to comfort Bathsheba in their loss of the baby. And then Bathsheba conceives, and she becomes the mother of Solomon. Well, the thing is, things haven't changed too much in regard to the treatment of women over thousands of years of history. Women and young girls are being used and abused as sex slaves throughout the world today. We've talked about this before. They've been used as a commodity to be used and thrown away. that men, have abused them and they don't care about them. All they care about is fulfilling the lust of the flesh. But we look at Jesus. This is his genealogical record, whose ancestors were Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. But Jesus elevated women. He treated them with the utmost respect. Even the woman caught in adultery, or the woman at the well whom nobody else would have had anything to do with. And as a result, women were some of Jesus's most faithful followers. And we read about this, for example, at his crucifixion. All the disciples had left. They had fled. They were scared. Except for John. He was there at the cross. And of course, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there. But in Mark's gospel, he records in the 15th chapter, verses 40 and 41, says there were also women looking on from a distance. Now, they couldn't get close. There were a lot of men, around the cross. And again, women were not regarded, as highly as men. And among those that were there looking on and seeing what was happening, they were witnesses to the crucifixion. They were Mary Magdalene. She had 7 demons cast out of her. And Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him, these women, and they ministered to him. What did they do? They probably cooked and cleaned and kept his clothes washed, and, they took care of his needs. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. So Jesus had a good following of women that were supporting him in his ministry. Here's Matthew's account of this in chapter 27, verses 55 and 56. There were also many women there looking on from a distance who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Joseph and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So some of the women were identified by their names and some just the mother of the sons of Zebedee. We don't know. Matthew didn't give her name. But women who ministered to Jesus, why would they do that? What were they getting out of it? Mary Magdalene was set free from 7 demons. She would have given her life for Jesus. The mother of the sons of Zebedee, James and John, her sons were part of Jesus's team. And they traveled around with Jesus. You don't think that Peter and the rest of them could take care of themselves without some help from women to get the groceries, to cook the food, to wash the clothes, those kinds of things. But they were willing to do it because they knew that Jesus honored, esteemed, and respected them. And that's why our subtitle was Created in the Image of God, Male and Female. We are all created in the image of God. And women, like I said, have been used as slaves. They're disposable. They're not highly esteemed by many men in the world today. And that's why you have the women's lib, because I'm sure that there's been women that have been abused and misused by men, and they have a lot of hatred and bitterness as a result. But that's not what God intended from the very beginning. We are all, Paul said, we're neither male nor female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. We were created in His image. We are valued in His eyes. And we need to, instead of, we all need to learn how to respect and honor one another. No matter what gender or what race or anything, any social standing, that we should honor, esteem, and respect one another. Love one another. Love with the right kind of love, not with the lustful kind of love. So, Father, I pray for women who have been abused and misused, taken advantage of, but I pray that you give them the grace and strength to rise above whatever they've encountered in their lives, and that they would realize that they are treasured and valued in the eyes of God. We all are. And we just want to thank you for it. Thank you for the way that you treat each and every one of us with the respect that we deserve. And we want to give you the honor and the respect that you deserve. Thank you so much, Lord, for your love for all of us. In Jesus' name.